Welcome to Talking Beats. I hope you'll subscribe and give us a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/talkingbeats. That's patreon.com/talkingbeats. We believe now more than ever in providing a platform for individuality, free thought, and a diverse range of views. By supporting the show this way, you'll get early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and much more. And remember, the conversation is always active at Talking Beats Podcast on social media. On today's program, we're speaking with beloved radio host Diane Rehm. She began hosting WAMU's local morning talk show Kaleidoscope in 1979, which in 1984 was renamed The Diane Rehm Show. She now brings a mix of honesty, intimacy, and curiosity to her podcast, The Diane Rehm Show. She has won a Peabody Award and was also presented with the National Humanities Medal from President Obama in 2014. I'm pleased to welcome her here to talk about her career, what she sees now happening in this country, and the responsibility of the media. Diane Rehm.
Thank you.
Why should we be using the word death? Why not passing? What does it signify culturally? If we say someone passed versus someone died, this is something you've talked about a lot. And frankly, death has played a role in your life from a young person up until now.
Indeed, it has. I think talking about death with the euphemism of passing simply puts the idea of death and dying out of our minds, or attempts to. The fact of the matter is we are all going to die, each and every one of us, and death is part of life as much as birth is part of life. So I do prefer to talk about death and dying rather than using the euphemism passing.
Do you think it's a religious thing? Is there some comfort that comes from a person of religious background to say passing, or is dying to somehow ameliorate what's happened? You said euphemism.
You know, perhaps for some people, using the word passing gives them greater comfort, and I respect that. I think each person has that right to choose what words he or she uses and how one feels about death and dying. I happen to believe that we should all look death and dying into the face and not pretend it's not going to happen to us, because in fact it's going to happen to each and every one of us. I also regard death and dying as so natural a part of our lives that it's probably better to acknowledge it, to accept it, and to know that eventually it's going to come to us.
Talking about words, you have a way of precision with words. You obviously use your words carefully. You've been in words, around talking, around interacting with people for decades. When did you first realize that there's such a thing as having a talent for talking to people?
You know, I've never regarded what I do or what I have or how I proceed as having a talent. It's simply part of who I am. I've always had a somewhat deep voice. I talk. I use words carefully. My late husband was an attorney for the U.S. government before he went into private practice. So he would call me out on using words incorrectly. So I'm always pretty darn careful about words that I use and how I use them. Tone of voice is also important. And on the talk show that I hosted for nearly 40 years, I was very aware that tone matters when you're talking with a person perhaps with whom you agree, or indeed someone with whom you disagree. And having that moderate tone of voice I regard as very important.
Having a moderate tone of voice implies a sort of reining in at some points of passions, maybe an opinion you find abhorrent, or an opinion that you're so in love with that you want to jump for joy. The moderation comes in. I wonder, were you ever frustrated feeling as you went home that day that maybe the moderation took over when you should have let the passion out, or did it become such a part of you, the automatic moderation for both views you liked and views you didn't like, and you knew that the job, being on public radio station, talking to people from all across the spectrum, required you to serve as a force of moderation?
I can assure you that there were times that I left moderation to the side. I'll give you two examples. Former governor of Maryland was due to be on my program. He knew that the start time of the program was 10 a.m. He arrived at 10:20. And I'm not trying to make a joke, but I really did ream him out on the air. Simply because he knew traffic very well in the Washington area and hadn't left enough time for him to arrive on time. And I found that very rude, and I told him so in no uncertain terms. Another situation regarded General Colin Powell. When he arrived at the studio, he gave me a great big hug and said, "Oh, it's wonderful to see you again." And then when we got into the conversation, because this was, of course, post-U.S. invasion of Iraq, I asked him whether his loyalty and his pledge was to the President of the United States, or was it to the people of the United States? And shockingly, he answered to the President of the United States. He then, when I asked whether he had any regrets about going to the United Nations and telling them that there were weapons of mass destruction, he said he had no regrets whatsoever. I was shocked, and I let him know it. And when he got up to leave, I assure you, there were no hugs, there were no kisses. He simply marched out of the studio. So I know when and how to use a voice that mostly is one of moderation, but at times needs some more force behind it.
How do you think a friendship impacts the expectation of an interview? You weren't friends with Colin Powell, but he certainly viewed you as a benevolent figure at the beginning of that interview. I wonder what kind of interview you would have had he given a different answer or had you not asked that question? I wonder if other topics would have been more illuminated somehow, or if the timbre would have been warmed or changed enough in a different way. It's interesting to picture that you went from a sort of, as I said, benevolent being at the beginning, hugging and kissing and greeting like you were the long-lost sister, to to let me get the hell out of this studio because I've been challenged.
I viewed my role as a talk show host as representing the people who were listening to that program. And therefore, friendship, familiarity, or otherwise would not have meant a single thing to me. My dearest friend could have come on, and if he or she had done something that the public regarded as in the least questionable, I would not have hesitated to ask about that.
What do you think journalists, people in the media, interviewers owe politicians in terms of airtime, in terms of respect, in terms of, frankly, degree to which one's taken seriously versus what they owe a listener? Where is the line?
The line is very clear. I represented my listeners. It is for them I am there asking questions. Questions I hope they might want to ask themselves. Of course, people, whether they're politicians or doctors or lawyers or trash men or women, all deserve the same respect. But that doesn't stop me from asking questions that I believe need to be asked.
You look around, you read, you listen, you observe what's happening now, fall 2020, with media coverage of politics.
It has become stratified, and there are people who will turn away from public radio, which attempts to present all sides, toward Fox, which attempts to produce one point of view, that of supporting the man in the White House. Newspapers are pretty much the same. The Washington Post, the New York Times, for the most part, represent a broad view of what is happening in this world. The Wall Street Journal, on the other hand, on its editorial side, represents a very conservative view of what's happening in the world, while its repertorial side gives readers the whole spectrum of ideas. So I don't think there is one word or one phrase that one can use representing or describing all of media. Media is a huge conglomerate. You and I are talking on a podcast. Podcasts have become part of the media world. Twitter, Facebook have all become part of the media world. So if you are being specific or if you are being more general, it depends on what your preference is, and that's how things have become more particularized as people turn to those sources that they most trust in and they regard as telling them the truth.
You're coming to something I wanted to cover a little later, which is the tendency by many Americans, something we've talked a lot about on this podcast with security experts, the tendency to gain news, to learn about news, I'm putting that in quotes, from questionable news sources, oftentimes coming from Facebook, oftentimes coming from Twitter. In fact, Tom Nichols, the Russia security expert, recently said on here, the best thing Americans can do to combat foreign interference is to stop getting news from Facebook and to stop getting news from Twitter, which is a decision every person can make for themselves. I wonder, Diane Rehm, is there a remedy that you see that is able to be put into place? We just heard it from Tom Nichols, but that means everybody has to make a conscious decision. Now, you mentioned the New York Times and the Washington Post covering a broad swath of political views. I think a lot of people would disagree, but let's just take that as the truth for the time being. What are people to do who are so distrustful of media? It is a trope right now. I don't trust the media. What's the remedy, Diane Rehm?
The remedy is to rely on news sources that are edited. And that is why your prior guest said flatly, don't trust Facebook or Twitter. Anybody can put anything at all up on Twitter and or Facebook. Newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal are editorially controlled so that there are layers of checking before something is published. Not so with Facebook or Twitter. And we've seen how reluctant Mark Zuckerberg is to offer that kind of editing on Facebook. And those who put forth Twitter can put anything at all up there. We read yesterday that Republicans have hired 20-somethings to put fake postings up on Twitter. Now, who is editing those people? Nobody. They're putting whatever they want to say, whatever might lead or mislead the American public, whether true or false. And of course, the Russians in the 2016 election managed to do that quite well. We're very concerned that they may be attempting to do it again in this, our 2020 election. I hope that there are enough people watching and being concerned about what goes up on Facebook and Twitter.
Well, regarding the Russians and maybe I think it's pretty understood that they are doing the same thing, perhaps even more aggressively, at least according to the many experts I've had on here. And one of them from the Center for Strategic and International Studies made a fascinating point to me, by the way, which was that Russia or another foreign power doesn't need to actually make any attack on a voting machine or on a voting roll. Just the idea online, just the announcement, we've hacked 1,500 machines in Michigan, and none of them were hacked. But the announcement could be devastating.
And where did that announcement come from, Daniel?
Well, if it happens, if it comes, which we hope doesn't, it would absolutely be via a social media.
Or the White House. Look, I am as concerned about domestic tampering with our voting process as I am about anything foreign that may occur. What's happened with the president telling people, first vote by mail, then go ahead and show up on election day and vote again. Now, there may be some people who believe that the President of the United States is telling them exactly what they should do. And how might that gum up the works? Also, our esteemed Postmaster General saw fit to remove voting boxes from many areas where underserved people would have a chance to deposit their mail-in vote, while the President of the United States continues to shout out that mail-in voting is going to mean fraudulent voting without any proof at all. So while you and your guests and even I talk about Russia, I am equally concerned about misinformation being delivered domestically and what the Postmaster General and indeed the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, could possibly do to affect the 2020 election.
You've been following the news for a long time. You spent almost 40 years daily talking about the news as well as cultural figures and cultural happenings. I wonder if you think to yourself in the morning when you're sitting down to work, I wish I could go on the radio right now and do exactly what I was doing. Open the phone lines, talk to people from all across the country.
You know, I am now doing 2 podcasts per week. We hear from a lot of people. They don't talk to me in real time, but they do send voicemails, they do send emails. In addition to that, I'm doing a once-monthly Diane Rehm book club. And this month, the book we've chosen is James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. On our monthly book clubs, we've had more than 1,500 people sign up for those monthly. So, you know, I think we're still reaching folks, and it's not in the same way. But as you may know, radio listening, because of the pandemic and because fewer people are riding long distances in their cars, are not tuning into radio as much and therefore are listening more to podcasts online or on their cell phones. You know, I'm fine with what I'm doing. I'm happy with what I'm doing, and I'm particularly happy that I can do what I do from home and still reach out to thousands of people across the country. The last book club we had, there were participants from 8 different countries, which stunned me. But it says to me, we're still reaching folks.
Talk about how you go about addressing what topics you're going to talk about. If there's anything that everybody can agree on, there's no shortage of issues. There's no shortage of things to talk about globally within this country, be it news or culture issues. There's so many stories constantly happening. When you look at the deluge of information, how do you mentally sort through and say, that's something I have to talk about?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example, and that is that yesterday in my weekly conference with my two producers, I said, James Fallows has a new article out in The Atlantic on how the media is behaving worse than it did in 2016. So we're going to have him on next Tuesday.
What is behaving worse? What did you take that to mean? What does behaving worse mean to you?
It's the headline writing. The headline writing that may go totally contrary to what's in the article, or concentrating too much on the foolishness that Donald Trump comes out with, focusing too much on his press conferences, so-called, in which he is supposedly giving good information to the American people, when in fact he's got this nutsy stream of consciousness going that has very little to do with reality. His statement when asked on the George Stephanopoulos town hall about global warming and the fires out west, his response, the weather's going to cool down. And the Post or the Times allows this man to continue to spread these absolutely unscientific comments. Now, what is the role of the press? To garner what scientists tell us, or to simply spread the information that a man who I regard as unbalanced and maybe really seriously ill? What is the responsibility of the press?
What are they supposed to do when it's the President of the United States talking? It seems that there's no option. You must report what's said. It's a very slippery slope if you say, well, that 30 seconds was particularly egregious, so we have to cut out here. I understand what you're saying, but it is the most powerful person in the world, and doesn't everybody have a right to hear what he said, whether they love it or hate it?
I assure you that the White House has ways of putting what he says out there, and they do. However, I don't believe that the press needs to report these fallacies over and over and over again as though they carry weight, because his comments do carry weight, even if they're totally false. I think we've got to find a different way to cover this particular president, which is why I'm so interested to hear what James Fallows has to say.
There are people who, from the beginning, said that there should be no coverage whatsoever of the press briefings beginning with Sean Spicer in winter 2017, because there were lies being told, such as the largest crowd ever to be at a presidential inauguration. Right off the bat, there were people, I remember Alan Chartock, for example, saying, on the other hand, we must be there for every second of this. If there's another way, I'd be very curious to hear it. I'll listen to what the gentleman says on your podcast. Maybe there will be a new way, but it seems filtration is impossible.
I think that we are seeing the disruption of truth, and that's what worries me the most. In fact, while I was doing The Daily Show, I was doing the Friday News Roundup with 3 journalists, and one of the Trump spokespersons, a woman at the time, came on and said, there are no facts anymore. Truth doesn't exist anymore. And that's what the Trump administration has been pushing right from the start. Kellyanne Conway said it first, but then her minions continued to use variations on that phrase. And if there is no truth, where does the media stand then? And how does the media approach a non-truth teller, a liar like President Trump?
I'll tell you where there is truth. There's truth in music. This program is called Talking Beats. I talk to everybody about music. There's truth in Bach and in Brahms and in Mozart and in Beethoven. Diane Rehm, any kind of music, doesn't have to be classical music. What do you like to listen to? I didn't mean that to be a leading question. I could have said the Beatles and Bob Dylan and Linda Ronstadt, and then
No.
What do you love? Tell me about your passion for music.
The Brahms Double Concerto is perhaps my favorite piece of music. Second to that, the Violin Concerto. I love piano. I studied piano for a while. Both my son and my grandson are piano players, classical music players. My grandson currently at Dartmouth continuing his musicianship. My son, who completed Oberlin with a degree in both music and intellectual history. He's now vice president of a small university in Pennsylvania. So music has been part of my life for a very long time. Classical music for the most part.
There's a wonderful story about a very famous recording of the Brahms Double Concerto. You probably know it. It's a recording with Jascha Heifetz on the violin, Emanuel Feuermann on the cello, Eugene Ormandy conduct, and the story was told me by someone whose teacher was in the Philly Orchestra for this recording session. Ormandy, the Philly Orchestra, Jascha Heifetz, the greatest violinist maybe of all time, are on stage. They're missing the cellist. He's not there. Emanuel Feuermann is not there. He was famous for not practicing for long stretches of time, going months without touching the cello, taking it out and playing perfectly. He did this for performances in Israel of the Dvorak Concerto. 20 minutes after the time the recording session was supposed to begin in Philadelphia, a door opens in the back of the hall. Not coming from the stage, not from backstage. A door opens, a figure, trench coat, fedora, cello case, cigarette. He walks down the aisle, straight down the orchestra, unpacks the cello, puts the cigarette out on the stage. They record the Brahms double in one take. It's one of the most miraculous recordings you'll ever hear. It's widely available. It's the Brahms Double Concerto, Heifetz, Feuermann, Ormandy conducting.
Oh, what a fabulous story. I've never heard that before. Really, that is just something.
And in fact, Brahms had loved the cello very much. As you know, the Second Piano Concerto has a very extended cello solo in the third movement, in the Andante movement. Brahms wrote beautifully for the cello. One of his best friends was a cellist. He wrote 2 sonatas as well, obviously. But he never wrote a cello concerto. And the double concerto is as close as he got to a cello concerto. When he heard the cello concerto of Dvorak, he said, wow, had I known one could write a cello concerto like that, I would have done it a long time ago. But luckily, we do have the double concerto, which is a tour de force for both instruments and for the orchestra.
Gorgeous. Thank you for sharing that story with me.
Diane Rehm, as you look back on all of the conversations you've had, I wonder what sticks out as something where you left the room thinking that was a joy, that was just terrific.
2 interviews. Several times I spoke with Maya Angelou, and the last time I had her on before she died, she said, "Diane, before we close, I want to say something to you." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "I want you to know that if you and I lived in the same town, I know we would be friends. You would come to my house for a glass of wine, or I would come to your house, but you are that friend I know I would have." I was so moved by that and so honored that she felt that way about the numerous discussions we'd had over the years. The other person who means so much to my heart even now is Mr. Rogers. I believe that he was one of the great human beings of our century who understood the need for kindness and acceptance among people, so lacking in our country today. I'll never forget him. He was just a great human being, and I was very fortunate to have had the chance to talk with him. I said to him, "Mr. Rogers, I think you and I probably have the slowest voices in broadcasting." And he laughed at that.
That's wonderful. Well, what are you looking forward to, and what are you worried about? What do you wake up worrying about as you look at the immediate future? We've touched on a variety of topics. What keeps you up at night, though, in the long term, as you look at fall, you look at all the things that are going to be happening this fall and into winter? What are you worried about, and what do you have confidence in?
Well, first, I worry most about my children and grandchildren. My grandchildren, both now, one already away at college, the other waiting to go because there is so much COVID at her college. So I worry about her. I worry about my daughter and her husband, who are both physicians working in the coronavirus wards. I worry about my son at the university, dealing with all these young people who may or may not act sensibly all the time. I worry about, and this keeps me up at night, I worry about the upcoming election and what our country will be if Donald Trump is reelected. I worry because I think he is a disaster for democracy, and our country could be heading toward a collapse of everything we have believed in, certainly in my lifetime. I am so supportive of Black Lives Matter and so supportive of the young people, both black and white, who are out there protesting these needless killings, these horrible takings of life. There has to be police reform, and I'm not talking about the sadly named defund the police, because I don't think that phrase makes sense. I don't think it means what it sounds like. I think the idea of moving more funds into ways to help people away from simply having police deal with issues that probably they shouldn't be dealing with would help us all. That's what keeps me up at night. But my hope, my optimism lies in the young people of the country. I think they're all ready to be on the right track, moving forward, worrying about climate change, worrying about every life that's taken, worrying about feeding the hungry, worrying about educating everyone, worrying about health insurance. I'm optimistic that the young people of this country really do have those thoughts in mind, and therefore I am optimistic about them.
I'll make a recommendation. You mentioned Brahms talking about optimism and heart. I'll make a recommendation for the German Requiem by Brahms. Ein Deutsches Requiem. It's a long piece. It's a very involved piece. The original title that Brahms gave it was A Human Requiem, and his publishers said we're going to call it German instead. It's a piece for the entire world. The word human came directly from Brahms. He was maybe the great humanist composer if you read his letters and you read what's written about Brahms. A man of incredible humanistic generosity and warmth comes out, and I encourage you and everybody to listen to the German Requiem by Brahms from a musical and a humanistic standpoint.
And I want to leave you with a recommendation to lift your heart. A movie that I know you know, Babe, about the little pig that could, and the Saint-Saëns music that is beneath that movie. I watched it and listened to that music because it so uplifts my heart and is worth watching and listening to just to feel a little bit better.
We'll do it. We thank you. Wisdom, insight, and your personal recommendations, Diane Rehm. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate all of your thoughts and your questions. And I'll take your recommendation seriously.
You've been listening to Talking Beats with Daniel Lelchuk. I hope you'll subscribe and leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. The original theme music for this program is by Ronald Markham. The content coordinator is Nathaniel Mose. Doug Christian is the executive producer. I'm Daniel Lelchuk. See you next time.